This video is going to discuss the OpenToonz viewer. The OpenToonz viewer has quite a lot of features, and I'm going to try and cover most of them by the end of the video. Now, there are two kinds of viewers in OpenToonz. There's the standard viewer, and then there's the combo viewer. Now, the difference between the standard and the combo viewer is that the combo viewer has all the toolbars built into the viewer itself, and the standard viewer does not contain those tools. The viewer has two main sets of controls. The buttons at the top will control the viewer, and then there is another set of controls at the bottom of the viewport. The buttons in the top right corner will control how the scene is rendered and what cameras you see. The buttons at the bottom will cover playback, and they will also allow you to get information about what you are rendering. Before we even start looking at any of the viewer's controls, we'll take a look at the viewer itself. The viewer is based off a traditional animation desk. In the center you have a piece of paper, and around that you have a wheel. And in a traditional animation desk, this would be used to rotate the image so that the artist could draw from different angles without destroying the registration of the image. The disk in the image gives scale and a sense of place for the image, but does not actually have any practical effect in OpenToonz. The first button will give you a safe zone. The point of a safe zone is to make sure that your composition will always be framed correctly so that it will always be in view and that your text will always be visible. You can use your safe zones to help compensate for when you have screens of different resolutions or when you have screens which cut off information from the sides of your rendered image. The next thing which we have is the field chart. In traditional animation, the field chart is used to lay out where characters will be in the scene. It's generally divided into north, south, east, and west, and the animator would generally calculate where his drawing was going to be in the scene using the field chart to make sure that it matched up with the background. The use of the field chart is also the main reason why the coordinate systems in OpenToonz are north, south, east, west, and not X, Y, and Z, which would be more typical of a standard Cartesian system. The next three buttons control how you navigate the viewer. The first button is just the default viewer, and is the view you currently see here. The first button will give you your standard navigation and will show you everything which you can see in the scene. So if I draw outside of the camera's plane, you'll see that what I'm drawing shows up in the view. The next view is the 3D view. The 3D view allows you to lay out things in the scene at different depths and makes it easier to lay out camera movements within the scene. In order to navigate the 3D viewport, you use the hand tool to pan, the rotate tool to rotate, and the zoom tool to zoom in and out. I'll go into navigating the 3D view in a bit more detail at the end of the video. The final button is the camera view. The camera view will basically give you the view of the camera and will cut out anything which is outside of the camera's view, so that line I drew earlier is no longer visible in this view. Next we have the freeze button, which is basically used with the next two buttons, and those buttons are the preview render and the preview subrender. I will not be discussing the preview subrender button yet, because the preview subrender button requires the use of options which are at the bottom of the viewport. Then if we use the preview render, we will get a render of the scene. In this case there is no obvious difference, so what we are going to do is we're going to add an effect. So we'll go to the schematic, and then we'll go to the effects. We'll add an effect, and in this case I'm going to add a blur. Plug the nodes in, and we will see that we now have a blur for the preview render in the scene. So basically the effect is visible in the preview, and it is not visible when the preview is no longer there. So now, in order to demonstrate the freeze button, I'm just going to hide this image in the background. So we'll start off by previewing the render, and got the basic render now. So if we unhide the image, you'll see that it now shows in the render. We'll hide it again and click freeze, and now if we hide the image, it will no longer update the render. So what you'll use the freeze button for is to stop the preview render from updating. So that's the majority of the top viewer controls discussed. We'll now move to the lower part of the viewer controls, and at the very bottom we have the caching for the scene rendering, and this will show you which frames in the scene have been cached into the memory for the preview render. I have loaded in an animated sequence, and if we go and click preview, we will see that this bar now turns red. The red shows all the images which the preview render has not yet cached. Now I'm just going to cordon off a small section to loop through. Then to render it out, I'm just going to press play, and it will render out a small section. You can see that each frame goes green as it is rendered, and then it leaves a small grey area which shows all the frames which are now cached into memory so that you can play through the rendered version of the preview animation. And now that those frames are cached, if I press the looping playback button, it will loop through those frames and we can get real-time playback on the rendered frames. Then above the frame number, we have a small menu which will allow us to hide and reveal any of the icons in the playback menu, allowing you to customize the menu to your personal workflow. The first button in the playback controls menu is a save button. It's to save the preview. We render a preview. The previewed render in the viewport over here will then be saved. So if we click the button, we will then get the save menu that will come up, which will allow us to choose our format to save the preview as. The next button is the snapshot button. I'm going to render out one column, and I'm going to click on the snapshot button, and then I'm going to render a second column, and I'm going to click on the compare button, which is next to the snapshot button. Then what you will see is that I get a slider in the middle of the image, and I can do a comparison between the first render, which did not have the first column, and the second render, which does have the second column. And this is particularly useful for testing effects. You'll see that I have added a blur, and that if I render, so what I'll do now is I'll remove the compare, take another snapshot, then I will unplug the blur and do another comparison. And now I should be able to compare between the version with the blur effect and the version without. The next button allows you to define a region for a subrender. We click on the button, we should be able to define a square in the screen. This is going to be its own rendering region. If I could then click on the subrender region, it should render only the area in that render. If I plug in the blur, you'll see that it only renders in that small square. By rendering in smaller areas, in scenes with lots of effects, you're able to test effects far more quickly. The next three buttons allow you to control how the background is rendered. The first button is white. It will give you a white background. So if we render it, we'll see a white background. None of the images we've rendered, however, actually have a white background. And in many cases, you will want to be able to see what the image actually renders like without a white background. So if we click on the next one, we will see the images with a black background. The next one is the transparent background, which will render the images as they actually are and will allow you to see what is transparent in the screen itself. And we have the playback controls. And in order to stop this from being excessively long, I'm not going to go into each playback control in detail. The next thing that we have are the RGB options for the red, green and blue. If we click on the bottom, you'll see the alpha for the red, the alpha for the green, or the alpha for the blue. If we click on the top, you'll see that we get the colors for the channel. So you've got the alpha at the bottom and the color at the top. And you can show multiple colors. So that's blue and green, but that would be green by itself. And that would be the red and the green channel, and the red channel by itself. Then we have the music controls. These will basically control music during playback. And then we have the histogram. And the histogram does not work with the viewport. I'm going to go through the histogram later, and I'm going to show you how to use it, but you need to go through it with a rendered sequence and not with the viewport itself. Then we have the zoom button, which will allow you to focus and zoom in on parts of the scene. This is a rather overcomplicated way of showing this, but I have laid out the scene so that I can show you how the cameras work in the 3D mode. So I've constructed an orthographic view using the zoom and rotate tools to zoom in and rotate the view, giving me a side view, a top view, a 3D view, and a camera view. Normally I wouldn't need the side and top view, but it is illustrative in this case. When laying out the scene, I will never let my camera go past 0. I can let purely background objects go further back, but when the camera moves past 0, you get some strange artifacts and some unexpected results, so it's best never to try and move the camera forward past 0. Now I'll select my camera, choose position, hold Control and move it past 0, and you'll see that the screen changes and starts to enlarge. This is not the result that I would want. So instead of trying to move the camera forward, I'm initially going to move my camera back. And then I'm going to enlarge the backgrounds so that they fill up the screen. Once again, you don't have to have your furthest back object at 0. It can be beyond 0, but you don't want to move your camera beyond 0 because your rendering plane is at 0. So I'm now going to enlarge the background. I'm just going to choose scale, and then I'm going to scale it beyond the size of the camera. And the size of the camera is the white that is visible in the 3D view. So I'm just going to scale this. Then I'm going to select my next layer, which is the play with the character. I'm going to move it forward with Z. So I'm just going to swap my tool to position. Then I'm going to hold down Control to move it forward in Z. And then you'll see that there are two black handles in the screen, which I can use to move the image up and down and sideways. I'm not, however, going to be changing the position in the scene. but instead we're going to get the final column and move that one forward as well. And then I'm just going to get the previous column and get it to go a little bit further forward. Going to select my camera again and just go to the final frame, and in this case I've accidentally already keyed it there, but I'm just going to change that final frame. Just going to clear it quickly. Now I can move in and out, and you'll see that when I move past an object, it will remove the object from the screen. So any object which I am past will lose visibility as the camera clips them. So what we're going to do now is play the scene. We're just going to loop through it. You should see the camera moving in towards the background. Now I'm just going to find a point in my scene where the camera is very close to this character. And then I'm going to move the camera so that you get a closer view on the character itself. So now I'm just going to grab one of the handles, and I'm going to move the camera up and across so that I can frame the character's face. So first just move up a bit and move it across to get the face in a better position. And then finally I'm going to loop through to play the animation, and you'll see that the camera now zooms in towards the character itself. Now I'm just going to go into the default view and get a better idea of what the scene actually looks like. If we play now, we'll get an idea of the actual camera movement. Then finally we will take a look at the scene from the camera view. So now we're going to return to the histogram. If we click render, we will see that the histogram is not really doing anything. However, if we go to output settings, we just render out the scene. I'm just going to render out a couple of frames. Now if I go to the rendered view and click on the histogram, you'll see that we now have a proper histogram. You'll see that we have the graph which shows exactly what our RGB values are. And if I click on the color picker, I can then sample values. What you will also see is that the color that is picked will show up in the picked color box. So if we look at a color over here, you will see that the picked color box right beneath the histogram shows that color. Also, we can draw an average color by holding down Control, and we can get the average over the selected area. And you'll see that that color will show up as well. So as you can see, all of the histogram values work correctly in the rendered viewport, but unfortunately they do not work in the standard viewport at the moment.